Hi, everyone. My name is Clara Valadarez Kientz, as she said. My pronouns are she and her. I want to first say thank you for this opportunity to speak today and for the College of Health and Human Sciences for inviting me to their Live Well series. I am honored to be an alumna from HHS and continue to speak proudly of this college to this day. So I graduated from K-State in 2014 with my bachelor's in family studies and human services, and then received my master's in counseling and student development in 2016. So I've been working for K-State Center for Advocacy, Response, and Education since 2015 and currently serve as the director, overseeing both advocacy services and prevention education. So for a while now, I've been interested in the idea of how our perception of bodies influence our perception of our self-worth, and additionally, how interpersonal violence is interrelated with those ideas. So I'm going to be touching on those experiences, how they intertwine later in my presentation today. So for now, I hope you'll join me in this conversation on the harmful effects of fat shaming, thin privilege, and how loving yourself as you are shouldn't be a radical idea. I need to first acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest on stolen land, which historically belongs to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Brand Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas, Nebraska. I offer gratitude for being here on this land. So, as I mentioned in my intro slide, I proudly serve as the director of K-State's Center for Advocacy, Response, and Education, otherwise known as the CARE Office. CARE provides confidential services to any student, faculty, or staff member who has experienced sexual violence, dating or domestic violence, stalking, or harassment. So whether these experiences occurred before coming to K-State, during your time at K-State, or after, we also serve alum, you are welcome to meet with us. Our services are free, voluntary, and confidential. We're located in 206 Holton Hall, open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 p.m. And we're also available for virtual appointments during this time as well. So today's presentation is a bit different than what CARE typically presents on. It's geared around the very personal and delicate feelings we experience around our own bodies and how that relates to interpersonal violence. So fat oppression and fat studies is sort of a newish and radical concept that emerged in academia with the intent to challenge the social issues around fat phobia and increased understanding of anti-fatness as a critical intersection with misogyny, sexism, and it is essential with how to begin to dismantle violence against women. Body image insecurities are hard to talk about. Some of us are not ready to talk about them, and that's okay. Some days I don't feel ready to talk about it either. However, it's something all of us can relate to, no matter our size or weight. It's something we all know is there, and it interferes with our daily lives, no matter if we want it to or not. And because of the sensitivity of these issues, I need to offer a content warning to inform you that I'm going to get vulnerable in talking to you today about anti-fatness, fat phobia, interpersonal violence, and trauma. So I encourage you to listen to your body and take care of yourself as needed. So I want to read a poem that I came across on TikTok. It was shared by one of my favorite authors. To my body. Many days I spent with you hidden under big, baggy, and flowy clothes. Some days I hated all of you, from my forehead to my toes. There were days I spent starving you, depriving you of fuel. Other days I ate myself into bed, using food as an abusive tool. I've told you that I love you, and under my breath whispered not. I've pushed you to your limits and made you give everything you've got. I spoke down to you often, said the meanest thing I could say, then expected you to carry me through each and every day. I have seen you in the mirror and cried at the very sight, then turned around and dieted strictly out of spite. I've told you I was sorry, my fingers crossed behind my back, knowing the next time I was hurting, it'd be you that I'd attack. I've broken every single promise I've ever made to you, but here you are supporting me with everything you do. You never cease to amaze me, how you can forgive and forget. I'll spend the rest of my life forever in your debt. I love you. The F word. I want to start by saying this word out loud, fat. So this is a sensitive and often activating word for several individuals and for valid reasons. We're used to hearing this word negatively. It's often been used as a weapon against us to incite shame and to make us feel worthless and bad and ugly. People have used synonyms like obese, overweight, chunky, chubby, plus size, big boned, curvy. If you're fat, you've likely heard them all and many more. And as a fat person myself, I need to reclaim this word. And that's exactly what I'm doing here and in this space, all spaces, formal, informal, virtual, not. Fat is not a bad word. It doesn't have to be a bad word. It is a descriptor in the same way that Latinx and queer are descriptors, short and tall are descriptors. It is also an identity. Fat is similar to being Latinx and queer and multiple other identities in that it also encompasses a marginalized group. Fat people have been shamed, rejected, discriminated against. For me and many others, reclaiming the word fat is a form of a revolution. In this presentation, I'll sometimes interchange the words fat individuals with individuals in larger bodies. And if you don't identify as a fat person, it's important to consciously use these words with understanding. So folks have different feelings about this word, and I certainly appreciate and respect that. We're all on different journeys. And however you choose to define that word, use that word, or identify is valid and okay. My only ask is that you work with me in breaking down the social systems that claim that fat bodies are unworthy of love. So I went to my first Weight Watchers class when I was 11 years old. I was the only child there. I didn't know what the point system was or how it worked, and I would often go to Weight Watchers on and off over the next few years, well into my teenage years, into early adulthood. The number of diets, teas, workouts, gym memberships, and ultimately the amount of time and money I spent on weight reducing initiatives is devastating, and it's just painful to think about, if I'm being honest. The Pizza Hut logo on here I have is because of a very vivid memory I have eating there once. And I remember going to the buffet and coming back to the table, and someone had made a comment like, "Oh, wow, that's a lot of food, isn't it?" And a friend sitting right next to me, a thin friend, had even more food on his plate than I did. Yet nothing was said to him about the amount of plate that was on his food, or on his plate, on the amount of food that was on his plate. The last image is a picture of a person wearing a baggy, oversized sweatshirt. I would always tell my friends that winter was my favorite season because of the cold and the snow. The truth was that I loved winter because it gave me a reason to cover my body and therefore hide my fat and the shame I felt. So I owned black sweatshirts that I felt would hide my body the best. And so when I think back to these moments, I'm reminded that folks have growth areas, and sometimes good intentions have harmful effects, and that doesn't excuse it, but it's something I've reflected on. When I think about, I went through my family's belongings actually, and I came across my great-grandmother's letter that she had written to her sister, in which she writes about her concern about her weight. And I'm sharing this because of the dates on this letter. And I don't know if you can see it, but the date is actually April 20th, 1921. which, if you'll notice, is exactly a century and a day ago to this date. So this is a part of my family's history, and it's important to me, but I'm also prepared to change the narrative and challenge weight stigma. By the way, Weight Watchers has received a lot of backlash for their app and encouraging children ages as like young as 8 years old to diet and whatnot. So there's a lot of information on that. So I quickly learned that I needed to shrink. If I couldn't shrink my body, I needed to shrink my presence somehow. So I did so by losing my voice, not actually losing my voice though. I just chose to not speak. So maybe if they couldn't hear me, then they couldn't see me either. That was kind of the thinking behind that logic, I guess. I know it makes no sense, but for some reason it did at that time. And so years later, when I was in college, a friend of mine and I went back to our high school to say hi to some of our old teachers. And one of my teachers was so shocked to hear me speak. She actually told me that she thought I was incapable of speaking because I never really spoke in high school. And so I wished folks had known that my inability to speak wasn't related to not really having a voice or really shyness so much. It was directly a result of body shame and internalized fat phobia. And so I noticed that when people, family, friends, or others talk to me, the conversations would be different than when they talk to others, like my thin counterparts. And so conversations often centered around my weight and health instead of my abilities or skills, dreams or aspirations, or where I was going in life. So instead, I was given recommendations for diet plans or workouts or gyms and whatnot. So, and please know that many of these items listed here are not inherently bad or anything. I'm not speaking ill of these, you know, if you do Zumba or go to the rec, or I'm not shaming these things at all. So the relationship to my body was directly in opposition to those who were experiencing thin privilege. So for those of you on the Zoom call today, how would you define thin privilege and who has it and what factors determine who has it? And how does thin privilege manifest itself in our careers, relationships, or daily lives? This is for anyone to speak up.
I would say thin privilege is like those who are smaller and have smaller bodies, they can like get away with, like you said, more, they can eat more versus other people who might be a little bigger and have the same portion and people might think that they are eating too much. And yeah, I think that people just look to them, but they also like on the opposite side, some people can think like, oh, they're not eating enough or whatnot. Like they just kind of get like the backlash, but they also get a lot more privilege versus those who are larger. So
Mhm. Absolutely.
I would say being able to exist in the world without worrying about things like, will I fit in the chair at the doctor's office in the waiting room? Or when I go on a flight and I travel, do I need to ask for an extension on the seatbelt? Or just going shopping anywhere, like stop at a farmer's market, see something really cute, not worry about, are they going to have my size?
Definitely.
I would also say that being thin typically is like the beauty standard in our world, especially in the US. I feel like that's like the standard that people look to, like all of the supermodels, all of celebrities. If they are bigger in the industry, like 5 years down the road, they have like lost 60 pounds and like look like everyone else.
I think there can also be an assumption, which of course this can be very incorrect, but an assumption that just because you're thin, that you're automatically very healthy. as opposed to someone who has a larger body, and it's assumed then that, oh, they must have diabetes and, you know, any of these other health concerns.
When it comes to relationships or finding relationships, when you're talking to someone online on Tinder, Bumble, whatever, feeling the need to, or I guess as a thin person, not feeling the need to clarify, like, oh, you realize that I'm thin, right? Like, make sure that you're not catfishing someone because they think you're fat, but you're actually thin. Like, that doesn't occur to thin people. Whereas as a bigger person, you would have to, or you don't have to, but there's this expectation or pressure to say, by the way, do you like bigger women or men or individuals?
Sure. Yeah, so in that sense, it's almost having to, experience like a coming out process. And I think one thing that is important to know, and something that I don't dive into as much in today's presentation, is that there are many individuals who experience thin shaming and eating disorders related to those experiences. And I recognize the very real and valid experience those individuals have. And I want to bring attention to that. I wish I had more time today to bring all aspects of body shaming into our conversation. And that's something that I will certainly do in the future if I'm able to explore this topic more in depth. But I do appreciate the conversation today. Thank you. Diving into, career success, those with thin privilege are often not assumed to be healthy because of their size, and people will assume they're lazy. Research has shown that obese or overweight candidates, as the study has shown, are less likely to get a job after applying, and also less likely to keep their jobs in comparison to their thin colleagues. One study that I found showed that 15% of hiring managers would consider hiring a fat candidate if there were additional barriers for women. And so we're seeing that in comparison to their male colleagues, women are having a harder time. I believe it was Ellie who mentioned this for clothing. Another example shows that if you have thin privilege, you can expect to find clothing in your size, and it's affordable. Plus size clothing is often overpriced and very costly. It's usually unavailable in rural areas and hard to access. Many stores don't provide larger sizes at all. Even still, if a store does provide larger sizes, you'll often find that they shove that section way in the back of the store, like as if they're trying to hide it. They're embarrassed about it. And if they do have it, they're probably not offering the same styles of clothing as the other sections. Really, there's so many examples of thin privilege. We could give them all day. We would be here for hours. So I want to address fat phobia and its correlation with body shaming, specifically how it hinders our ability to love ourselves. Fat phobia, plainly speaking, is the fear of being fat, the fear of fat people, or the fear of fatness. The term is popularly used when referring to people who hold oppressive attitudes or beliefs against a specific population, much like the terms homophobic, transphobia, xenophobia, etc. And while the term fat phobia is still commonly accepted and used, I would like to introduce the term anti-fat and focus in on the meaning behind this word. So anti-fat is the hatred of fat people, or fatness, and often the two terms are conflated. One thing is clear: people who hold anti-fat attitudes aren't afraid of fatness or fat people, they just hate us. Oppressive behavior isn't the same as phobia, and it's problematic to individuals with phobias, which are real mental illnesses. So when we step back to analyze fat phobia versus anti-fat, what we're really seeing is that fat phobia is more likely to be an internalized fear. Growing up in socialized spheres where fatness was seen as ugly, bad, or lazy, it makes sense that we will naturally internalize those social norms, expectations, and then fear fatness in ourselves. The impact of this is so large that we see entire industries supported by this one social concept. Exercise videos, diet programs, weight loss supplements, they're all fueled by internalized fat phobia. And then in correlation, anti-fat comments and attitudes continue to perpetuate harmful myths around fat bodies, also elevating the success of those industries. So there's multiple terms that have been used to describe these harmful experiences. Fatmesia uses the Greek miso, meaning hatred. And this term is somewhat in its infancy and haven't used it very much, or haven't heard people using it very much. And so it sometimes takes some explaining due to the unfamiliarity of it. Sizeism is also a related term, but can be limited in the exactness of what anti-fatness includes, as it focuses more on the size of a person and not the entirety of the person's experience in oppression. Fat shaming frequently invites arguments of skinny shaming, which, as I've mentioned before, skinny shaming is not okay either. No form of body shaming is ever okay. However, it's just not the focus of the discussion at hand. And so I recognize that the use of these words is deeply personal for those who have been targeted by anti-fat commentators or oppressive systems. And I want to make it clear that whatever words you use to describe your experiences are valid and not up for debate. So several individuals, and fat women particularly, are constantly being told what to do with their bodies, especially if their bodies have the audacity to deviate from the status quo. Thus, fat women and fat people are receiving health advice from licensed medical doctors every day. Except they're usually not licensed medical doctors, but instead average people who are just wanting to share their opinion on what they consider to be healthy. And while they claim to be doing so out of concern, it often does more harm than good. And there's a lot of evidence that supports that bodies of all sizes can be healthy. And the body mass index scale is generally not a good tool to use for individuals, as it does not consider all aspects of a person's identity. And again, I'm a person who is not a licensed medical professional, so take that as you will. But the purpose of my presentation today is not to center on a health debate. And so I'm not going to go into details about diets or workouts, because I believe those to be very individualized. Fat bodies can be healthy bodies, and in the same sense that thin bodies can be unhealthy bodies as well, as Elena mentioned earlier. It's important to note that a person's health, weight, or diet information is not grounds for judgment, and ultimately, all bodies are good bodies. So fat oppression and anti-fatness affects people of all genders, but there is a specific and nuanced anti-fat bias that affects gender minorities, specifically women and trans individuals. So to view it through this lens, we need to look at feminism, fat phobia. For fat women specifically, they're forced to be happy with unrealistic beauty standards and societal expectations of what constitutes appropriate womanly appearances and this ideal, feminine body type. So since women are often idealized into needing to be petite and fragile, the fat women's deviance from this can lead to harmful consequences, as we discussed. So they're often deemed lazy, dirty, or not feminine. And so women are systematically conditioned to hate their bodies for a number of reasons, and often have higher beauty standards than men, creating additional barriers for them. So I'm going to move into the connection between body shaming and interpersonal violence. So I'll first do that by offering the objectification theory, which is a framework that places female bodies in a sociocultural context with the aim of illuminating the lived experiences and mental health risks of girls and women who encounter sexual objectification. It's important to know that objectification is in and of itself a form of gender oppression and also factors into and enables other forms of oppression, including sexual violence. And so the focus of the objectification theory has primarily been on white middle-class women, but we need to be prioritizing the lived experiences of women of color as well as trans women of color who have the highest risk of sexual violence and homicide. The ideal body type, as we know in the US, is usually based off of mostly white, slender women, and media images are highly unattainable for the average person. So individuals who receive body-focused messages from their partners will often internalize those messages and apply them to their own bodies. Interpersonal violence can negatively affect body image, as the research has shown that abusers will use body-focused comments centered around shaming and objectification. Additionally, the dynamics of interpersonal violence are strongly influenced by cultural factors and stereotypes imbued on women of color. So we know that the severity of interpersonal violence, including sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and physical assault, were significantly associated with high levels of bodily shame and objectification. Greater than 1/3 of interpersonal violence experiences resulted in injury, which can lead to permanent functional or appearance changes. So when we're thinking about physical abuse that can occur and often does occur in abusive experiences or relationships, the impact that results from potentially the kicking, punching, strangulation, or other violent behaviors can leave victims or survivors requiring surgery or with lifelong permanent changes to their body. Some examples of those abusive behaviors are controlling a partner's diet or exercise routines, watching a partner eat, or punishing a partner for eating. So research shows that childhood sexual abuse might be a key predictor in weight in adulthood. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention ran the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which evaluated the impact of experiences in children and the influences of those experiences in adulthood. This study looked at everything from poverty, divorce, income, abuse, and the more ACEs a person has, the more likely they'll develop greater health risks in adulthood. So childhood sexual abuse is one of the most severe experiences, or more severe experiences, I should say, and therefore most likely to increase life stressors and make it more likely an individual develops eating disorders or unhealthy coping mechanisms later in life. The research also shows that trauma that occurs during critical periods in the brain's development can change its neurobiology, making it less responsive to rewards and increasing the risk of addiction later in life. So with their brains unable to produce that kind of natural high that we often get from eating, many adult victims of childhood abuse will chase after happiness or satisfaction in food and increasing that. So this is a common and natural result from trauma, unfortunately. Another thing is that many survivors will put on weight in order to protect against future abuse. So the perspective or reasoning kind of behind this is, maybe if I'm seen as unworthy, and again, here we see with, this problematic view of equating fat to being unworthy. But the survivor is thinking, maybe if I put on this shield, I won't be victimized again. So it's not uncommon for survivors to shield themselves with a variety of different means, and using food is one of them. A harmful myth is that in order to be sexually assaulted, a victim or survivor must be considered sexually desirable. Now, there are many different things wrong about that. The first being that who gets to determine what is desirable and why. This is just really subjective. But also this indicates again that fat people can't be desirable. We know that's false. The impact that this myth has is incredibly detrimental because it leads to victims and survivors not being believed when they come forward to share their assault or report to law enforcement. So there have been studies done on weight biases in sexual assault cases, and results found that men reported greater rape myth acceptance, anti-fat attitudes, and were more likely to place blame on fat victims. Participants also expressed greater sympathy for the perpetrator. So ultimately, the results revealed that women in larger bodies or fat victims and survivors face additional barriers when reporting their experiences of sexual assault. And this is particularly to male-identified police officers or detectives. So a recommendation here would be to provide women-identified detectives to respond to sexual assault cases. But given the prevalence of this issue and the lack of resources and police departments across the nation, this might not be an option. So the picture on your screen is of Brazil's current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who told a fellow congresswoman during a heated argument on television that she was too ugly to be raped. So he, along with many other politicians, have made comments about women's bodies that are very problematic. And so I'm sure many of us can think of other examples in which similar comments have been made. So knowing this information, what steps can we take to dismantle systems of body-based oppression and ultimately reach radical self-love? I think a good place to start is by watching our language or being conscious of our language, and not only what we say in front of others, but what we say to ourselves as well in our internal dialogue. So what we'll often hear others say is, I feel so fat today, or I ate like a pig and whatnot, So we can start by changing that language that we use. It's a small step that makes a big difference in the way that we perceive bodies. Believe survivors and remain cognizant of the barriers in which fat survivors in particular face in making reports of their experience. In doing so, challenge victim blaming myths in conversation with friends and family when you hear destructive anti-fat comments being made that make it more likely that survivors aren't believed and that perpetrators are never held accountable for their actions. Dedicate yourself to a journey of radical self-love, no matter what your body image journey is. I'll be sharing some resources in the next few slides and books that have been really helpful for me in my journey. And I like to note that it is a journey, because there will be days when one might revert back to some problematic thinking or harmful thinking and perceptions of fat phobia. And so just knowing that it can be difficult to unlearn years of socialized thinking. And so just have compassion and be gentle with yourself during this journey. So some simple yet helpful things that I do to practice radical self-love include positive affirmations or repeating mantras. One that I continuously do is all bodies are good bodies. I'll just say that, like, all bodies are good bodies, all bodies are good bodies. If I have a negative thought about my body, or I should say when I have a negative thought about my body, I repeat that mantra. It reminds me that my body moves, my body breathes, my body can do so many things. It's phenomenal when you think about what our bodies can do. I think it's important to know that not only should we stop comparing ourselves to others, but that we should actually increase our, complimenting others and ourselves as well. Focus on what we do love about our bodies. And then I encourage you to write it down. On a bad day of insecurity, write down 3 things that you do love about your body. Focus on your whole self. We are so much more than our appearance. We have so much more to offer. It's easy to get caught up in beauty products and pictures, but dive into something that you are passionate about and focus on that for a while. It can bring you good emotional health. And then I again want to reiterate the intersection of all of our identities. We are complex humans, and whether our experience is that we are survivors living in fat bodies or whatever it might be, there are resources and services available. Surround yourself with images you want to see. This one is really important for me. Follow accounts that make you happy and remind you that all bodies are good bodies again. I've included pictures of some of my favorite Instagram accounts that I follow. These folks bring me joy and remind me that not all social media is bad. I have the choice and power in who I follow and what images I choose to see. This has been extremely helpful for my mental and emotional health. I encourage you to remove toxic accounts that only make you feel discouraged about your body and serve as a reminder that the ideal body type is unattainable. There are inspiring, beautiful, and real accounts that can bring peace to your life. So I encourage you to do a social media detox if you need to. One of my favorite examples is Lizzo, the queen. She's talented and makes it known that loving yourself is 10,000% okay and encouraged. So if you're not following her, please do. She's awesome. Lastly, I'm coming to the end of my PowerPoint. I would fail if I didn't tell you about these amazing books that were game changers for my mental and physical health. The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor helped me understand what radical self-love truly is and how it's never okay to apologize for existing, for being in my body. Things No One Will Tell Fat Girls by Jess Baker encouraged me to not only love my body, but to be proud of it. All of these here are really strong reads. And if you've registered for today's event, you'll be getting the PowerPoint too. I want to mention also that if you are someone who is interested in receiving support about your experience, if potentially if you are supporting someone or yourself with an eating disorder, whether it be now or in the past, Counseling Services has a really cool support group and experts who are really well versed in eating disorders and providing support for folks. So Brianna Prezzuti and Cody Walls at Counseling Services, and I have their information here. So there's that. Please reach out to them. And then lastly, follow us on all of the social medias if you'd like. We post a lot of cool things, I think. I don't know, I'm biased, but yes, so follow us and come to our many, many events. And yes, thank you for having me today.